Morning. Good to be here with you all. Please turn your Bibles to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. I encouraged you to memorize this passage. That was a long time ago that I encouraged that. I'm not sure many remembered. But I still encourage you to memorize this passage because it is packed with wonderful truth. We're called to meditate on Scripture. We're called to think on things above. And passages like this one are especially good for doing that. Even when you don't have a Bible around. If you have a passage like this memorized, there are so many wonderful truths about Jesus, powerful truths about Jesus, that you can think about while you're in the car driving, while you're facing difficult situations. And so this is one of those excellent texts to memorize. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul has been thinking about his concerns for this church while he's in prison and while he's writing to this church he's never been to, and he's thinking about what they need and the challenges that are facing them. And he just told them, I have been thanking God for the fruit that King Jesus is producing in your life. He said, I've been praying that Christ would bring more fruit into your life. And as he thinks about all of the stuff that's going on, and as he thinks about how the solution is Jesus, he kind of takes what some people might call a detour for a second here, after talking about what he prays about, to just focus on Jesus. To just glory in who Christ is. And I hope that we'll be able to take this passage and do the same thing. That as we see the things that are going on in our world, that it will be in our minds and in our hearts so much that we'll take detours that aren't really detours. We'll take lots of moments to recenter ourselves throughout our day on these great truths about King Jesus. So I'm going to read this passage, Colossians chapter 1. We're splitting it into two parts. It continues to verse 20, but we'll start here in verse 15. Chapter 1, verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The key idea of this week's lesson and next week's lesson is that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He's not just a neat idea that some religious people have. He wasn't just a teacher or a prophet or just one manifestation of God among many. He is the image of the invisible God. That even though we can't see God, that when you see Jesus, you see God fully for the first time. Of course, we were all created in God's image, but we failed. We're going to learn later in Colossians that we need to be renewed in the image of the Creator. Because even though we were made in God's image, we, with our freedom, have chosen to act in ways that God does not. So that now when people look at humans, they don't really see that much about what God is like. But Jesus is the image of God. Not only in a way that we aren't, but in a way that we never can be on our own. He is not only perfect, he is himself divine. So that when you see Jesus, you see God. Paul is later going to use this key word a bunch of times in the book. He doesn't use it here, but it's the idea behind this passage. Jesus is God's wisdom. We've been talking about how in Colossae, there's people who think they need something deeper, something wiser to really help them understand the world. And there's a lot of Christians right now in our day who think they need some deeper wisdom to help them live through the world. But Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is God's wisdom. In Proverbs 8, a passage that's worth taking the time to read all of because it's so much behind Colossians 1, but I'm going to read you an example from Proverbs 8. It says, when he established the wisdom, this is wisdom is speaking here. When he established the heavens, I, wisdom, was there. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him. Like a master workman, I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. The Jewish scriptures say that at the beginning of everything, God's wisdom was there bringing about the world. That God's wisdom ordered the world. Later Jewish writers, in a book called The Wisdom of Solomon from the 1st century BC, it said, "For wisdom is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, an image of his goodness." The real wisdom is not whatever philosophy is being peddled today on the internet or that is being whispered in secret societies or anything like that. The real wisdom is the wisdom that ordered creation. And Paul is saying in this passage that Jesus is that wisdom. Jesus is the image of God. The other phrase I want to draw your attention to in this passage, that's going to be repeated next week as well, is that Jesus is the firstborn. How do you know that Jesus is the image of God? What is it that we see about Jesus that shows us that he is like God, that shows us how God is? Well, it's his role as the firstborn. First, what we're going to look at today, the firstborn over creation, and then next week, the firstborn of the new creation. What does it mean for Jesus to be the firstborn? Well, in the ancient world and in some traditional cultures today, the idea of the firstborn is the role that you have in the family. It's really not about birth order or when you were born. It's about who is going to be in charge of the family. Here's an example of this in Psalms, talking about David, who, of course, wasn't actually the firstborn in his family. It says, "And I will make him the firstborn." And then the parallel line that explains that is, the highest of the kings of earth. David and the son of David would be the firstborn. And what that means is he would be the highest king. He would be in charge. So the way that we see what God is like is when we look at how Jesus rules the world. When we see how Jesus is the firstborn over creation, how Jesus is the firstborn of the dead. Okay, well, what are some things we see in his rule? The first thing it mentions is, by him all things were created. By Jesus, all things were created. All things. And when I say there's a lot in this passage, I want to take a minute. You don't have to memorize everything or remember every term that I say here, but I want to give you a lot of examples of how rich this passage is with truth. And how, if you memorize this passage, it can help you navigate so many false ideas in this world. When he says, by him all things were created, he mentions things in heaven and things on earth, visible and invisible. And then he lists a bunch of spiritual powers of his day. These thrones and powers and dominions, these were various spiritual beings that people put their faith in. People like the Colossians may have been afraid of them and looked for something to protect them. These demons and angels and spiritual things like stuff behind the occult and sorcery and various kinds of spiritualities. Jesus is the one who created all things, even the spiritual powers. Even things that people are afraid of are under his creative power. Things that people worship and that they fear, heavenly beings in the heavenly places, Jesus created those. There's no reason to worship them. There's no reason to fear them. There's no reason to wonder and worry about your life and read your horoscope to figure out what's going to go on, or to go to a psychic to figure out how things will be. It's not just that those things aren't real, which is what a lot of Christians think. It's that even when those things are real, they're not anywhere close to as powerful as King Jesus, who made all things, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or power. By him, all things were created. In our day, we don't speak so much of the spiritual powers, although there are some New Age people who do. We speak more in terms of different religions in our day. And yes, we all need to learn how to love each other and to live together, but one of the things that people want us to do in this day and age is treat all different gods and all different worldviews and all different religions as equal, as if they're all just different truths that are true for you, or as maybe being true in a certain way for each culture. But this passage says that Jesus created all things. And if there are, again, any real spiritual powers that are behind the world religions, and my view from reading scriptures is that there are. There are gods. There are spiritual beings. And yet Jesus is the one who created them. So we should not fear these gods, and we should not trust or worship these gods. We should put our trust and our worship in the one who created all things. That applies also to earthly powers. One of the ideas that we're going to see in Colossians is that the spiritual powers manifest themselves in worldly systems, in governments, in nations, in world religions. That these real beings in the spiritual realm come to this world in the form of world powers. And so in Asia Minor, if you were a Colossian, you would be told to worship Caesar, to put your trust in the gods and goddesses of Rome and in the government of Rome. In our day, people may put undue faith and undue allegiance in our nation, either in our leaders or in our system of government, treating civil documents like the Constitution as almost sacred or inspired. But these things are part of the world that God created. We should never give our total allegiance to Caesars or to constitutions or to any worldly power, because all things were created by Jesus. That applies to the home, and the sort of idealized 1950s home at least. The man is the Lord of the house. He has the say-so. But all powers, even if it's just the power that is the man of the house, was created by Jesus. Which means in the home, the man does not have the final say. In the home, King Jesus has the final say. So whatever realm you're talking about, whether it's the spiritual realm or world religions or world governments or even your household, it's King Jesus who created all things. Which means no one is truly independent of him. This is really cheesy. I debated cutting this out. I would not like it, honestly, if I was listening to the sermon. But I couldn't help but think about this, so apologies for the cheesiness that's about to come. There are people who try to declare independence from King Jesus. There are atheists. There are people who say they're spiritual but not religious, which means that they're vaguely spiritual, but they don't feel they need to listen to Jesus. It reminds me of this scene from The Office. I'm not recommending this show. Don't say that I recommended this show, but this is a great scene. Michael Scott has this huge financial problem, and he's racked with debt, and someone tells him about bankruptcy, and he goes, "This is the way out." And so he goes out of his office and he says with all the seriousness and sobriety that he can muster, "I declare bankruptcy." And then the financial guy afterwards says to him, "Well, you can't just say it." And Michael Scott says, "I didn't say it. I declared it." As if that somehow makes it official. That's how I feel when we think, again, I'm sorry I used such a cheesy thing to say something much more serious, which is, that's what it's like when someone says, "I don't need God. I'm an atheist." Or I'm a Muslim and I don't need Jesus' identity as God. Or when you just say, "I'm spiritual but not religious." Whenever we try to declare our independence, it's like a joke. Just standing out there saying, "I don't need him." Meanwhile, every molecule you breathe was created by him. You were created by him. The last one here is a little more in-depth, and it's not stuff you probably think about every day. Although, if you're going to learn anything about ancient philosophy, this is one of the main ideas I think Christians should learn. And it's not because you don't know anything about it. It's because actually Western Christianity is dominated by it. It's one of the philosophical ideas that was so prominent in ancient history that it still controls so much of Christian doctrine even today. The only thing is people don't realize it. The whole issue we were dealing with, the denial of the bodily resurrection a couple years ago, is one of the consequences of how prominent this false philosophy was. That's a statue that's supposed to be portraying Plato. And the reason I'm giving you this here is not just because it's important to our day. It's, I think, the main issue that the Colossians were being tempted by, a form of this idea. Plato divided the world into two categories. You may not have heard this unless you remember back to high school days. Platonic dualism. The dualism that Plato taught, which is that there are two realms. There's the realm of forms, the realm of ideals, where there are the perfect ideals, not just a chair, but the ultimate chair. Not just someone who's loving somebody, but love itself. And in this higher realm of ideas, everything is eternal and perfect and beautiful. But then there's another realm, the realm of physical things, the realm of temporal things. And those never reach the heights and the beauty and the glory of the realm of the forms. These things are temporary, they're corrupt, they're even evil. And this idea, this basic idea, has taken on lots of different forms in the history of God's people. But one of the forms it takes in our day, whether or not you've ever heard of Platonic dualism, is that there are two realms. That there's the realm of the spiritual and the realm of the physical. And the spiritual realm is eternal and good, and the physical realm is temporal and bad. Or we might, in the more secular world, divide things between the sacred and the secular. Sacred and the secular. What we're doing here, that's sacred. What you do at the voting box, that's secular. As if Christians can divide their lives between these two realms of the secular and the sacred, the spiritual and the physical. But this does not fit the view that Paul describes here. Jesus created all things. Which means there's not a realm that's inherently good and a realm that's inherently bad. The same Jesus who created the spiritual realm is the Jesus who created the physical realm. The Jesus who created the sacred things created what we call the secular things. Which means, in a very real sense, there is no secular world. It's all His world. It all belongs to Jesus. And so even though it might be this out there abstract philosophical thing, it's a very practical thing, because there are some Christians who compartmentalize their lives between the Jesus stuff and the secular stuff. Tom Hamilton, a preacher down in Florida, has an illustration about this, how he said a lot of times Christian families, Christian homeschooling families especially, which I was homeschooled, for those who don't know. I know most of you do. And we homeschool our children, so I'm not mocking something I'm not. But one of the things that was common, I don't know if it still is you buy the Bible version of everything. You don't play Outburst, you play Bible Outburst. You don't play Bible Pictionary. You don't play Pictionary, you play Bible Pictionary. And if you get blocks with letters on them, you don't say A is for apple, B is for bear. You say A is for Adam, B is for Bible. Everything is made into something religious. But even that sort of buys into the idea that these are God's things, and then these are secular things. But the same God who created the Bible created the apple. It all belongs to Him. It's all sacred. It's all, in some sense, spiritual, because it is all created by God who is Spirit. And so the Colossians may have been very tempted to worship, to fear different things, to punish their bodies so that their spirits could be emphasized, or all of these sorts of things. And we may divide our life into spiritual and into secular, but what this passage says is all things were created by Jesus, which means all things belong to Jesus. All things are to be submitted to the rule of King Jesus. The first point is the longest point. This was all one long first point, just so you know. The others are a bit quicker, but they're in the same vein. The next phrase I want to draw your attention to is that in him all things hold together. So not only did King Jesus begin everything, not only did he create everything, but he holds everything together. Again, this is a word you may not use every day, but there's a view called deism that was very prominent with our founding fathers. Most of them were not the Christian men that some imagine. They were mostly deists, even the ones who called themselves Christians. This is a picture of Thomas Paine, and he's one of the more famous and prominent deists who believed that there is a creator, but he creates a universe that's sort of like a clock, that you wind up and then you set it in motion, and it just all sort of follows fate. It follows the purposes of God by God starting it, and then he sort of takes a hands-off approach. So, Thomas Jefferson, for example, in his version of the Bible, there's no miracles. Because God doesn't involve himself in the world that way. He creates it, he winds it up, and then his hands off. So there's no miracles. There's no active presence of God in the world. But Paul says that Jesus is the one who holds all things together. Not only did Jesus start things, he holds it all together. Every day, every minute, Jesus is present with his creation. It's not just marching along to its fate in some cold, separated way. Our God is here. The way that Paul puts it, quoting a Greek philosopher, a Greek poet, is, in him we live and move and have our being. We are not divorced from our God. He just started off and then circled the earth, fly away and do other things. Our God holds it all together. This is also different than I won't use a label here, but the view that there's no ultimate meaning. The view that there's no ultimate purpose. That either you create your own meaning or you just accept that there is no meaning at all. No, that's not how it is. We're not left on our own to find our own meaning and to write our own story or to face a meaningless world. Jesus holds it all together. Every minute. We're never alone, even though some people might look up at the stars and feel like they're just this nobody floating on a speck of dust through the universe. The Christian looks out and sees a whole universe held together by God. Another view that this combats is the view that God is just this angry God looking to destroy everything. That God is just an angry God that wants to send everybody to hell and just wants to zap people from the heavens, some cruel tyrant. That can't be the way God is. Because the only reason we're alive today is because God is holding things together. This was the central point of Jonathan Edwards' fire and brimstone sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I quote it a lot, you may notice, because I think it was a great sermon where he says, the only reason that you do not slip into hell this minute, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, whether you know it or not, the only reason this minute the earth doesn't evaporate and you sink into hell is because God is showing you grace right now. God is holding the universe together for you right now. God is keeping you alive right now. So if God's just an angry tyrant wanting to destroy everything, why is he holding it all together? There is a God, a present God. The song that we teach children is a song I think a lot of us need to remind ourselves of. He's got the whole world in his hands. We teach it to our children a lot. He's got the whole world in his hands. When our children are wondering about things that we can't control, when they're nervous about the virus, especially early on, we would say, I don't know, but he's got the whole world in his hands. When our children worry about family that they can't see right now, I don't know, but he's got the whole world in his hands. And that's true for us too. What is God like? He's the God who made everything. And he's the God who holds everything together. All of this stuff, by the way, that I've quoted so far was said of wisdom. And so someone might think maybe he isn't actually talking about any person. Maybe he's just talking about reason or wisdom or something like that. But the next thing I want to draw your attention to is something that was never said in any Jewish scriptures about wisdom. In fact, it's not something the Jewish scriptures ever said except about God himself, Yahweh. It says in Colossians 1 that all things were created for him. All things were created for Jesus. This is not some mere prophet. This is not even just wisdom. The only one that things were created for is God. In fact, that's the thing said again and again throughout the Old Testament, is that God, the Father, Jehovah, says, I created these things for myself. I will not give my glory to another. These are for me. And then Paul says, all things are created for Jesus. And the only thing that can mean is that Jesus is one with the Father. Jesus is God. Jesus is fully divine. He created all things, and all things were created for him. That means certain things about where our commitment needs to be, where our faith needs to be, where our gratitude needs to be placed. If everything was created for him, then everything I am and everything I'm given, I need to offer up to him in thanksgiving for being the God who created everything. But it also tells us something about Jesus' commitment. This is a point that I made a lot in Isaiah, because it's the point made in Isaiah so often. But if all things were created for Jesus, we do not need to worry. You realize that? If all things were created for Jesus, we don't need to worry. Because Jesus will see things through to their end. If this was just created for me, I don't know. I don't deserve a good outcome. Maybe Jesus wouldn't see it through if it was just created for me. But it was created for him. It was created for the glory of the eternal God. And Jesus will see it through to the end. Which means even though right now when we look at creation, what we see is hatred and jealousy and violence and death, and we might think, is that all that this is? Is that all that's left for us? We know that can't be it. Jesus didn't create a world of violence and death and bloodshed that he could have. He created a world for there to be peace and joy and the universal worship of him. So if all things are created for him, one day Jesus will make sure that every knee bows and every tongue confesses that he is Lord. And we will live in a land in which righteousness dwells. The conclusion of this section, verses 15 through 17, is that Jesus is before all things. Jesus is before all things. Now, one thing that means is literally, temporally, he's before all things. Before anything else was made, Jesus already existed. He's before all things. But I think more than that, what this is saying is that in terms of authority, he's before all things. In terms of value, he's before all things. In terms of glory, he's before all things. If he's the creator of everything, then there's nothing in all creation, visible or invisible, that you could take and say, this is better than he. This is before him. No, he created it all. He holds it all together. It only exists for his sake. So he's before all things. So everything else you and I might be tempted to trust or to fear or to worship this week is something that was created by him. And it's living on borrowed time. It's living on borrowed time. Everything else we might pursue comes ultimately from him. If those things are functioning as they should, if there is real beauty there, if there's real goodness there, then that is just a small, imperfect mirror of the Jesus we really need. And if those things are not what they should be, they're rebelling against the one who holds them together. And if you ally yourself with them, when Jesus casts them all into the lake of fire, where will you be? Everything is living from what God supplies. In the end, they cannot give us anything that Jesus does not already infinitely and perfectly have within himself. Which means there is nothing deeper. There's nothing more than the Christ who is the image of God. There's nothing fuller or more satisfying than the Christ who holds all things together. There's no greater story, no greater purpose, no greater calling than to love the one for whom all things were created. So, we need to give thanks to this King. We need to give thanks to this King in our spiritual life, our religious life. We need to make sure that Christ is the head of our church and that we should respect him as that. We need to make sure that we are honoring him in our families as the true Lord of the house. We need to make sure that in our time as pilgrims in this world, we never trust or pledge allegiance higher to this world than to Christ himself. He alone is God. All of life needs to be submitted to the one who created all of life, who holds all of life together, and who will bring all of life to its appointed end for his glory. If you're here and you're not a Christian, you can leave this building this morning pretending that you don't need this Jesus. But you will walk on an earth created by him, breathing air created by him. It's time to acknowledge who your King is and to give thanks to him for giving you what he has given you. To submit to him in faith by being baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins. And for those of us who are Christians, let us meditate on passages like this. When political ads turn on, when family members tell us, you've got to do this for the family. When people say, common sense says this. When people tell us there's something deeper or more spiritual, let us meditate on the Jesus who is the image of God. The one who created all things. The one who holds all things together. The one for whom all things were created.